a 5-foot pile of computer instructions that sent the crew of Apollo 11 to the moon and got them back.
For decades, humanity believed that Apollo 11 landed on the moon thanks to the calmness and extraordinary skill of the astronauts. But the truth is quite different. In the final 3 minutes of life and death, Armstrong was almost completely helpless. Another entity silently took control of the spacecraft.
That's source code for the Apollo guidance computer.
It stripped the astronauts of their privileges, disregarded orders from Earth, and made its own decisions to save the greatest mission in human history at the last minute. NASA kept this secret for decades to protect the legend of the space heroes. But Margaret Hamilton, the female engineer who created that system, finally decided to speak out before her death. And what she revealed may be the most chilling truth ever to emerge in the history of the space program. The night the moon almost killed them. 3 minutes before Eagle touched the surface of the moon, the mission began to die. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were trapped inside a cabin barely larger than a closet, descending through the silence toward the sea of tranquility. Every instrument was running. Every system was operating at full capacity. The lunar surface was rising fast beneath them. And then the computer aboard the spacecraft began crying for help. 1202 alarm, then 1201, then 1202 again. The sound tore through the cabin and cut through mission control like a blade. In Houston, Flight Director Gene Kranz watched as 200 engineers suddenly fell silent. Hands froze over their consoles. Voices vanished into the air. The room, designed specifically to manage chaos, became a tomb. Steve Bales, the 26-year-old guidance officer responsible for the computer systems, stared at his screen and felt his hands turn cold. He knew exactly what those alarms meant, and he knew there was almost no time left to act on that knowledge. This is what NASA never explained to the public. These were not ordinary warnings. During every training simulation, those alarms had been flagged as events that must never happen during powered descent. They meant the guidance computer, the only system keeping the astronauts aligned with the surface, was drowning in data. It was collapsing under the weight of its own workload. And if it failed, Armstrong and Aldrin would lose guidance, lose orientation, and lose any chance of landing safely or ever returning home. Armstrong's heart rate surged past 150 beats per minute. His voice remained calm over the radio, but his body was betraying the truth. Aldrin read numbers from the display, shouting out altitude and descent rates, trying to make sense of data that no longer made sense. On the ground, controllers scanned their screens in growing panic, desperately trying to determine whether the computer could survive a few more minutes. And Gene Kranz had seconds, not minutes, not even a full minute, to make a decision that would shape human history. Every controller in the room looked toward him. Every screen flashed warnings. The clock was counting down. Abort the mission and admit failure before the entire world. A decade of work. Billions of dollars. Kennedy's promise to the nation. All of it dying on live television while 600 million people watched. Or continue forward and gamble 2 human lives on a computer that was already screaming in distress. But here is the truth. At that exact moment, hundreds of miles from Houston and 384,000 kilometers from the moon, a woman named Margaret Hamilton was watching the same stream of data on her own monitor. She was the lead software engineer who had built the Apollo guidance computer from nothing at the MIT Instrumentation Laboratory. She knew every line of its code. She understood its architecture, its limits, and its failure modes better than anyone alive. And when she saw those alarms flashing across the feed, she later described her reaction with one word: terror. This had never happened before. Not during testing, not during simulations, not during any previous Apollo mission. These alarm codes were theoretical, warnings for scenarios engineers believed would never truly occur during flight. Yet they were triggering over and over again during the most critical 3 minutes in the history of space exploration. Hamilton understood immediately that something was feeding the computer more data than it could process, and she knew just how close that had brought the crew to death. The reason the computer was failing did not begin in Houston or on the moon. It began years earlier, inside a quiet laboratory at MIT, when a little girl pressed buttons she was never supposed to touch and accidentally exposed a fatal weakness that NASA refused to fix. The child who broke Apollo. One quiet evening, Margaret Hamilton brought her young daughter Lauren to the MIT Instrumentation Laboratory. Engineers were running routine simulations, testing how the guidance system would perform during a standard lunar flight sequence. To them, it was just another night at work. To a child, it looked like the cockpit of a spaceship. Lauren sat at the console. Pretending to be an astronaut, she touched the keyboard and pressed several keys without understanding what they controlled. The system collapsed instantly. Guidance data vanished. The simulated spacecraft lost its position, its trajectory, its orientation, everything. Across every monitor in the room, the mission disappeared. The virtual crew was stranded in space, unable to determine where they were, and with no path back to Earth. Now, here is the unbelievable part. The computer had not malfunctioned. It did exactly what it had been programmed to do. Lauren had accidentally triggered a pre-launch program called P01 during the flight simulation. The system obeyed the command perfectly. It erased all navigation data because that was precisely what P01 was designed to do. The computer had no understanding that the timing of the command was catastrophically wrong. Some engineers in the room simply shrugged. It was only a simulation. No real danger. Restart the system and continue working. No spacecraft had been endangered. No lives had been threatened. Just a child playing with buttons. Hamilton did not shrug it off. She later said the realization struck her like a punch and refused to leave her mind. If an astronaut under pressure, trapped inside the chaos of a real emergency, entered the wrong command sequence at the wrong moment, the result would not be a failed simulation. It would be a crew drifting helplessly through space, with no guidance, no navigation, and no route back to Earth. The next morning, she went directly to management. She explained in detail what had happened. She requested permission to add protective code, layers of software capable of detecting this type of mistake before it killed someone, even if the person pressing the buttons did not realize what they were doing. The answer came immediately and coldly. No, the software was already too complex. Astronauts were highly trained professionals. They would never make a mistake like that. Her request was rejected, and Hamilton refused to stop. She filed formal reports. She argued in meeting after meeting. She documented every concern and was dismissed every single time. Then Apollo 8 launched in December 1968, and everything she had warned about happened almost exactly as she predicted. While orbiting the moon, astronaut Jim Lovell made a mistake. He activated the P01 program during flight, precisely as Lauren had done during the simulation. Navigation data immediately began to corrupt. Confusion spread through mission control. Controllers scrambled to rebuild the spacecraft's position manually, transmitting corrective data line by line back to the command module. Apollo 8 survived, but only barely, and only because the crew was in orbit, not attempting a powered descent toward the lunar surface. If the same error had occurred during landing, there would have been no time left to repair anything. After that incident, nobody at NASA dismissed Hamilton's warnings again. She was finally given full authority to build the defensive systems she had demanded for years. She added layers of protective logic, code capable of recognizing human error and stopping it before it spread into catastrophe. Code capable of interrupting astronaut actions in the middle of execution if the system detected dangerous commands. Code capable of forcing the computer to prioritize survival instead of blindly obeying every instruction it received. And this is the part they rarely tell you. That decision, the decision her managers nearly killed by saying no, the decision they delayed for years because they trusted human training more than software protection, would become the only reason Apollo 11 did not end in the worst disaster in the history of human exploration. The code that chose survival. In the 1960s, computers were rigid and unintelligent machines. They followed instructions in exact order, one task at a time, with no flexibility, no judgment, and no ability to adapt when conditions changed. And when something unexpected happened, anything outside the programmed sequence, they stopped completely. No recovery, no backup plan, no second chance. Failure was immediate, total, and irreversible. Margaret Hamilton refused to accept that as the final answer. She understood something most engineers of that era did not want to hear. Spaceflight was chaos, wrapped inside a thin shell of control. Astronauts would press the wrong buttons. Sensors would feed the system corrupted data. Radar systems would flood processors with unnecessary information. Systems would overload at the worst possible second. A computer that could only freeze or collapse under pressure was not just a technical limitation. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. And this is the critical point. What she built next did not even have an official name yet. The concept barely existed in computer science. Hamilton designed software capable of thinking in terms of priority. Software that could evaluate in real time which tasks mattered most and which could be sacrificed when processing power was running out. Her system could interrupt itself. It could recognize overload conditions, stop non-essential operations, and redirect every remaining resource toward the core functions keeping the crew alive. Instead of collapsing, it could shed weight and continue flying. But this is what made it truly revolutionary and deeply unsettling to many inside NASA. Hamilton's software was built around one terrifying assumption: human beings would fail. Not might fail, would fail. The machine had to be prepared for that certainty. It had to be ready to override human input, ignore human commands, and make its own decisions about what mattered for survival when seconds became more important than authority or chain of command. Think about what that meant in 1969. A computer overriding astronauts. A machine making life and death decisions without asking permission first. This was not simply unconventional engineering. It sounded more like the plot of a science fiction nightmare than technical documentation for the most important space mission in history. Many senior NASA engineers opposed the idea from the beginning. They believed human judgment must always remain the final authority. Hamilton argued that human judgment itself was the problem. She fought for every line of protective code against colleagues who believed she was making the system unnecessarily complicated. There is a famous photograph of her standing beside towering stacks of Apollo guidance computer printouts nearly as tall as she was. Every page in those stacks represented a decision about what mattered and what did not. Every layer of protection was a judgment about life and death that she had to defend, justify, and sometimes fight fiercely to include. And during those final 3 minutes above the lunar surface, with alarms screaming inside the cabin, 2 human lives hanging from a thread of code, and 600 million people watching television without realizing how close everything had come to collapse, every one of those judgments faced its final test. What the computer did next was something NASA spent decades trying to bury. When the machine took control. When the 1202 alarm triggered inside Eagle, Hamilton's software did exactly what she had designed it to do years earlier inside the laboratories at MIT. The root cause was almost absurdly simple. The rendezvous radar switch had been left in the wrong position. A small and seemingly trivial human mistake was now flooding the guidance computer with unnecessary radar data at the worst possible moment of the entire mission. The system was being forced to process more information than it was physically capable of handling, while simultaneously attempting to land a spacecraft on the moon. And this is what matters most. Under normal conditions, with the standard software architecture that existed before Hamilton redesigned the system, this kind of overload would have caused a complete and unrecoverable collapse. Guidance data would vanish, navigation calculations would freeze, landing would become impossible. The mission would have to be aborted. And even aborting would have been extremely dangerous, with a computer no longer capable of reliably calculating the trajectory required to return to the command module orbiting above. But Hamilton's code did something no machine had ever done before in the history of spaceflight. It made a choice, not a pre-written reaction, not a fixed sequence of instructions. A real-time judgment about what mattered and what did not. Her priority system evaluated every running process within milliseconds, faster than a human blink. It identified which tasks were absolutely essential for landing, and then it killed everything else. It discarded low-priority radar processing. It eliminated non-critical calculations. It preserved guidance. It preserved navigation. It preserved altitude tracking. It redirected every last fragment of computational power toward the only set of functions capable of bringing Armstrong and Aldrin safely onto the lunar surface. The computer overrode its own standard operating behavior in order to survive, and it did so faster than any human being could react. Faster than any controller in Houston could even finish reading the alarm code on a screen, let alone decide how to respond. Steve Bales, the young guidance officer, realized what the computer was doing just in time. He understood the system was not failing. It was saving itself. He turned to Gene Kranz inside Mission Control and delivered the judgment that changed history. The computer is handling the overload. It is shedding tasks and protecting guidance. Kranz processed the information in an instant and gave the order that would define the mission. Continue the landing. Eagle touched down in the Sea of Tranquility with less than 25 seconds of fuel remaining. 25 seconds between history and catastrophe. And from that moment forward, the story split into two completely different versions. The public version, the version NASA gave to the press, described the landing as smooth, controlled, and carefully managed. The alarms were mentioned only briefly, reduced to minor computer issues that were handled safely. But behind closed doors, inside classified post-mission technical reviews, a very different story emerged. Gene Kranz and the flight control teams documented just how dangerous the situation had truly become. They knew the guidance computer had come within seconds of triggering an automatic abort. They knew the system was operating far outside any comfortable safety margin. It had fought to survive, shedding processes and clawing its way through an overload that should have been fatal. And they knew the mission succeeded, for one reason no one inside NASA wanted to say publicly. The computer had made the critical decisions. Not Armstrong, not Aldrin, not Mission Control. The machine had automatically overridden the corrupted flow of data created by human error. It chose on its own what would continue running and what would be sacrificed. It saved the entire mission by making decisions faster and more accurately than any human being could. And this is the part they rarely tell you. This is what Hamilton later described as NASA's real discovery on the Moon. Not the rock samples, not the photographs, not the footprints. The real discovery was that human-controlled spaceflight, the foundational idea behind the entire Apollo program, had already become obsolete. The machine had proven it could perform the job better at the single most critical moment of the mission. And NASA buried that reality because the entire space program, its funding, its public support, its Cold War propaganda value, all depended on the carefully constructed myth of the heroic astronaut. Calm, commanding, and always in complete control. Apollo 11 proved that myth was dead, so the story was cleaned up. The alarms were reduced to footnotes. Hamilton's name disappeared from major headlines. And one of the most important revelations in the history of space exploration was locked away inside technical documents almost nobody outside the agency would ever read. The confession NASA buried. For decades, Margaret Hamilton kept most of the weight of what she knew far from public view. She continued working on software systems. She continued thinking about failure. But she did not run to the press. She did not publish a memoir exposing NASA from within. She allowed the agency's polished version of history to stand unchallenged through the years. But as the decades passed and the pressure of the Cold War faded, she slowly began saying openly what NASA never would. And she was brutally direct about one thing above all else. The software did not support the astronauts during those final 3 minutes above the moon. It did not merely assist them. It did not simply help their decisions. It saved them from themselves. And this is the part they truly never wanted the public to understand. In one interview, Hamilton admitted, "The thing I worried about most when taking on a manned mission was, what happens if there is an emergency?" That single fear, she explained, shaped every design decision she made for the Apollo guidance computer. Every defensive layer of code, every priority protocol, every protection system she had to fight management to include. She did not design the system for success. She designed it for failure. She assumed the absolute worst would happen and built software capable of surviving it. Years later, she explained the core philosophy behind her approach, with words that still carry enormous weight today. "I realized I could provide a solution: to let our software interrupt the astronaut displays and replace them with priority displays." Think carefully about what that means. Her code was designed to override the astronauts, seize control of their displays, force the machine to show only what mattered for immediate survival, and suppress everything else, whether the astronauts wanted it or not, whether NASA leadership felt comfortable with it or not. And that is exactly what happened during the most dangerous 180 seconds of Apollo 11. The system she built, the system her managers tried to block for years, the system born from a little girl pressing the wrong buttons inside a quiet MIT laboratory, automatically took control at the single most dangerous moment in the history of human exploration. It made decisions no astronaut could have made fast enough. It overrode the consequences of human error. And it landed the spacecraft. When Hamilton finally spoke openly about it, her confession was not about demanding credit or chasing recognition. It was a warning. What Apollo 11 truly proved, and what NASA quietly buried inside technical documents for decades, was that the moment human beings enter genuinely complex systems, the greatest threat to survival is not the hostile environment outside the spacecraft. It is the human beings inside it. And the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe is software built by someone courageous enough to assume that everything, absolutely everything, will eventually go wrong. Every system you rely on today operates on that principle. Every aircraft autopilot, every hospital patient monitoring system, every self-driving vehicle moving along modern highways, every algorithm manages electrical grids, financial markets, and nuclear safety systems. All of them trace back to the principles Margaret Hamilton fought to establish at a time when senior leaders told her she was wrong, told her she was overreacting, and insisted trained professionals would never make the kinds of mistakes she was trying to protect against. They were wrong. She was right. And the proof is standing directly in front of you. The reason you know Neil Armstrong's name today is because Margaret Hamilton's code brought him home alive. So here is the question. If the Apollo guidance computer had not overridden human error on July 20th, 1969, if those two astronauts had died on live television before 600 million people around the world, would humanity ever have returned to the moon? Would the space program have survived? Or would mankind have looked up at the lunar surface and seen nothing but a graveyard? Leave your answer in the comments below. And if this story shocked you, make sure to like and subscribe, because the next video will go even deeper into the secrets NASA kept hidden inside the Apollo program. Click the video on your screen right now, and I will see you in the next one.